What exactly do you bring to this marriage besides expensive taste? My mother-in-law's voice cut through the Thanksgiving dinner chatter like a sharpened knife. She swirled her crystal wine glass, the burgundy liquid catching the light from the chandelier I'd restored by hand. A woman who married into money should at least know her place. The table fell silent, 20 pairs of eyes shifting between us as I carefully set down my sterling silver fork beside the sage and apple stuffing I'd spent hours preparing. The words hung in the air of the historic Victorian home they had no idea belonged to me long before I'd ever met their precious son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled, smoothing the napkin across my lap. What an interesting perspective, Eleanor, I replied, my voice steadier than the trembling in my fingers suggested. Perhaps we should discuss what each of us brings to this family. My husband James squeezed my knee under the table, a silent plea to let it go. Again. Always again. Eleanor Blackwell, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer pantsuit, that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, narrowed her eyes at me from across the antique mahogany table that had been in my family for 3 generations. I'm simply concerned about James's future, she said, reaching for the crystal. Gravy boat. In my experience, women who come from humble beginnings tend to have expensive tastes once they marry well. My father-in-law Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably, but said nothing to contradict his wife. The family patriarch in title only, spine long since surrendered to Eleanor's will. James's sister Charlotte pretended to be deeply interested in rearranging her cranberry sauce, while her husband David suddenly became fascinated with the crown molding I'd painstakingly restored. Last spring, the coward's approach to family conflict. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, the one that appeared whenever Eleanor unleashed her thinly veiled insults about my background, my career, my existence in her son's life. 3 years of marriage. To James, and still she viewed me as an interloper, a fortune hunter who had somehow tricked her brilliant investment banker's son into marriage. "How is the turkey, everyone?" James asked desperately, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal. Sophia brined it for 2 days. His attempt at diversion was as transparent as Eleanor's contempt. "Delicious," Richard muttered, the first word he'd contributed to the conversation in 20 minutes. "Divine," Charlotte added with forced enthusiasm. "You'll have to give me the recipe, Sophia." Eleanor wasn't so easily deterred. "Where exactly did you grow up again, Sophia? Some small town in—" She left the question hanging, perfectly manicured, nails drumming against the tablecloth monogrammed with the B for a family I hadn't been born into, but whose home I owned. "Mapleton," I supplied, reaching for my water glass to cool my burning throat. "About an hour north of the city." I didn't add that Mapleton had been devastated by factory closures when I was a teenager, or that my father had worked double shifts at the remaining textile mill until his hands were raw and his back permanently curved like a question mark. I didn't mention the nights I'd spent studying by flashlight when the electricity was shut off, or the scholarships I'd fought for to escape a town that was slowly dying. Eleanor didn't deserve those parts of me. "Right, Mapleton," she said, as if recalling a particularly distasteful food. "And your parents were—" "Teachers, wasn't it?" "My mother taught 3rd grade," I confirmed. "My father worked at Westland Mill." I held her gaze steadily, refusing to be shamed for a hard-working heritage that had taught me more about resilience than Eleanor's country club upbringing ever could. "How quaint," she murmured, the word transformed into an insult in her mouth. "And now you restore old furniture? As a hobby?" She made it sound like I collected dead insects or talked to imaginary friends. "Sophia runs her own architectural restoration business," James interjected, a rare moment of backbone emerging. "She specializes in historic properties. She's currently overseeing the renovation of the old public library downtown." $1 million project, I added quietly, sipping my wine. My third this year. Eleanor's smile tightened. How fortunate that you have James's support to pursue such creative endeavors. At that moment, the grandfather clock in the hallway, my grandfather's clock, though Eleanor didn't know that, chimed 7 times, the rich tones resonating through the dining room with its hand-painted wallpaper and original hardwood floors that I'd spent weeks refinishing when we first moved in. When I first allowed the Blackwells to move into my family home, I remembered the day I'd stood in this very dining room as a child, my grandmother explaining the history of each piece of furniture, each architectural detail. This house has been in our family for 4 generations, Sophia, she'd told me, her weathered hand resting on the carved banister. It may not always look like much, but it's built on solid ground. Remember that. No matter what happens, you'll always have a home. Here, when my parents died in the car accident my senior year of college, this house had been my inheritance, along with the family's historic restoration business that had fallen into decline during my father's years at the mill. Graham had kept it, going through sheer force of will until her stroke, after which the business existed mostly on paper, waiting for me to graduate and decide its fate. James mentioned you're considering selling that eyesore on Maple Street and building something modern, Richard said, clearly attempting to steer the conversation to safer waters. Smart move. This neighborhood is finally coming up. Property values have doubled in the last 5 years. My husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We haven't decided anything yet, Dad. Actually, I corrected gently, we're not selling. The Victorian on Maple is being restored as part of the Historical Society's preservation project. I didn't add that I was the one who had initiated the project, or that I had personally secured the grant funding that would transform the neglected mansion into a community arts center. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Such sentimentality is impractical, dear. That money could be much better invested. James, surely you've advised her on this. Her tone suggested I was a particularly slow child who needed financial guidance beyond my comprehension. Sophia makes her own business decisions, James replied, the strain evident in his voice. She's quite good at it. I'm sure she is, Eleanor said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Though one does wonder where she learned such acumen, coming from such humble beginnings. The word humble again, her favorite weapon, disguised as polite conversation. I thought about the folder in my office upstairs, the one containing the original deed to this house, the property tax records, the documentation of every upgrade and restoration I'd personally overseen. Documentation I had planned to finally show them tonight, after 3 years of biting my tongue. I had excellent teachers, I replied, meeting her gaze directly. My grandmother taught me that true value isn't always obvious at first glance. Speaking of value, Eleanor continued, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision. James tells me you've been resistant to their new investment opportunity in the harbor development. Such a shame to miss out. The returns would be substantial. It took all my self-control not to laugh. The harbor development she referred to was a poorly disguised tax shelter that several of my clients had already backed away from after my discreet warnings. The environmental impact study had been falsified, the zoning variances obtained through questionable channels. I knew because I'd been approached first, my restoration company's reputation making me a desirable partner to legitimize the project. I'd declined. I prefer investments with more sustainable outcomes, I said carefully, aware of James's sudden tension beside me. Sustainability doesn't pay for designer dresses and luxury vacations, Eleanor replied, her gaze flicking dismissively over my simple black dress, tailored but hardly designer. Mother, James warned, finally finding his voice. That's enough. I'm simply looking out for your interests, darling, she said, patting his hand across the table. Someone has to think about your financial future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My financial future is just fine, he replied tightly. Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Of course it is, darling. The Blackwell name opens every door. She turned to me, triumph glittering in her eyes. Sophia, be a dear and fetch the dessert. I think we're all ready for something sweet after this heavy meal. Not a request. A command, delivered with the absolute certainty that I would obey, would know my place as the outsider who should be grateful to serve the family I had married into. 3 Thanksgivings I had endured this treatment in my own dining room. 3 years of swallowing my pride, of honoring James's plea to keep the peace, of hiding the truth about who really owned the elegant Victorian home that Eleanor constantly critiqued and planned to renovate properly once James came to his senses. James squeezed my hand under the table. A silent apology. Too little and far too late. I stood slowly, smoothing the napkin before placing it beside my plate. Before dessert, I think there's something we should discuss. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. Sophia, James murmured, a warning note in his voice. Maybe not now. Now is perfect, I replied, not taking my eyes off Eleanor's imperious expression. In fact, it's long overdue. Eleanor sighed dramatically. If this is about my comment regarding your background, I assure you I meant no offense. We're simply from different worlds, dear. Different worlds, I echoed, tasting the phrase. You have no idea how right you are, Eleanor. I walked to the antique sideboard, my great-grandmother's wedding gift, though Eleanor believed it was a reproduction James had purchased, and removed a thick folder from the drawer. The weight of it in my hands felt significant, like the final exam that would determine my future. What's that? Charlotte asked, curiosity temporarily overcoming her studied neutrality. This, I said, returning to the table but remaining standing, is the history of this house. Our house. I emphasized the word deliberately, watching Eleanor's eyebrows rise fractionally. We're hardly interested in architectural details during dinner, Sophia, Eleanor said dismissively. Perhaps another time. It's not just architectural details, I continued, opening the folder and removing the original deed. It's ownership details. Specifically, who owns this house that you've been so eager to renovate, criticize, and occasionally compliment when you forget yourself? Eleanor's expression sharpened, her social mask slipping to reveal the calculating woman beneath. What are you talking about? James purchased this house before you were married. It's been thoroughly documented in your prenuptial agreement. I smiled, the first genuine one of the evening. That's not exactly accurate. I placed the deed on the table, angled so Eleanor could read the name clearly. Margaret Sophia Caldwell, my grandmother. This house has been in my family for 4 generations. I inherited it when my parents died. I've owned it outright since I was 22 years old. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Eleanor's face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching horror as understanding dawned. That's impossible, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. James said what I asked him to say, I interrupted, gently, because I wanted to know if I'd be welcomed into your family for who I am, not what I own. James reached for my hand, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Sophia and I agreed to let everyone believe I'd purchased the house. We wanted to see how she'd be treated without the complications of her actual financial situation. Eleanor's gaze darted between us, calculation replacing shock. I don't understand. If you owned all this, why would you pretend to be the penniless gold digger you've treated me as for 3 years? I finished for her. That's an excellent question. I removed another document from the folder, The business valuation of Caldwell Historic Restoration, completed last month. Perhaps this will help clarify things. I slid the document across the table, watching as Richard's eyes widened at the number on the bottom line. 7 figures. Significant 7 figures. "You own Caldwell Restoration?" he asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "But that's one of the most respected firms in the region. They're handling the Westmore Library renovation, the old courthouse conversion, the public library project I mentioned earlier," I supplied. "Yes, that's my company. The one I inherited from my grandfather, rebuilt from near bankruptcy, and have grown into what it is today." Charlotte was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "But you always seemed so understated." "Because wealth isn't something I parade around," I replied simply. "It's not my identity. It's simply a result of hard work and careful stewardship of what my family built." Eleanor's hand shook slightly as she reached for her wine glass. "If this is true—" "It is," James confirmed. "Sophia has more family money than I do, Mother. She always has. That investment opportunity you keep pushing? She declined it because her financial advisors identified the same problems mine did. The ones I tried to tell you about, but you wouldn't listen." "But you work for the company," Eleanor said accusingly, as if I'd somehow tricked her son into manual labor. "I'm the CFO," James corrected. "When the previous financial officer retired last year, Sophia asked if I'd be interested. It was a significant step up from my position at Morgan Stanley." I watched the calculations happening behind Eleanor's eyes, the rapid reassessment of everything she thought she knew about our relationship, about me. 3 years of barely disguised contempt for the gold digger who had ensnared her son, suddenly colliding with the reality that I was, in fact, the wealthy one in the marriage. "Well," she finally said, her voice brittle with forced lightness, "this is certainly unexpected. Why didn't you tell us sooner, darling?" The term of endearment sounded foreign from her lips, addressed to me. "I tried, several times," I said, quietly. "But you were always so certain about who I was and what I wanted that you never actually listened." "The first Christmas dinner," James reminded her, when Sophia mentioned the restoration business her family had built. "The garden party last spring," I added, when I tried to discuss the historical significance of this neighborhood. "Even our wedding," James continued, when Dad asked about the venue and Sophia explained it had been her grandparents' property. Eleanor's cheeks had flushed an unbecoming shade of pink. "How was I supposed to know? You said nothing clear about any of this." "We said everything," I corrected her gently. "You just weren't listening." I gathered the documents back into the folder, feeling strangely light, as if a weight I'd carried for 3 years had finally been set down. "Now, I believe you mentioned dessert. I made maple pumpkin pie from my grandmother's recipe, the same recipe she used in this kitchen for 40 years before I took over." As I stood to head to the kitchen, Eleanor's voice stopped me, smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Sophia, I may have misjudged certain things." I turned back, taking in the woman who had made me feel small and unworthy in my own home for 3 years. "Yes, Eleanor, you certainly did." The clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent dining room. My grandmother's clock, in my grandmother's house, marking the moment when everything changed. The tension in the dining room lingered as I sliced the maple pumpkin pie, my grandmother's silver server moving through the dessert with practiced precision. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear the muted, urgent whispers of the Blackwell family grappling with their new reality. Eleanor's voice, though hushed, carried an edge of indignation that 3 years of marriage had made me all too familiar with. 3 years. It seemed both an eternity and merely moments since I'd first encountered James Blackwell on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at the Westmore Library fundraiser. I had arrived early to assess the building's ornate plasterwork, clipboard in hand, dressed in practical clothes that could withstand the fine dust of century-old buildings. My hair was pulled back in a simple knot, face free of makeup after a morning spent in a crawl space examining foundation issues at another site. I wasn't there as a guest but as a potential contractor, invited by the Historical Society to provide a restoration estimate. The grand reading room was empty except for a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit standing before one of the massive, arched windows, his back to me as he studied the intricate stained glass. I cleared my throat, not wanting to startle him. "I'm sorry. The fundraiser doesn't begin for another 2 hours," I said, stepping further into the room. He turned, and my first thought was that his eyes matched the blue in the stained glass perfectly, a detail my restoration-focused mind automatically catalogued before I registered anything else about him. "I know," he replied with a slight smile. "I'm avoiding a lunch meeting by claiming I needed to prepare my remarks for tonight." He gestured to the empty podium at the front of the room. "Are you with the catering staff?" The assumption might have bothered me from anyone else, but there was no condescension in his tone. Just a simple question. "No, I'm here to examine the plasterwork," I said, pointing to the ceiling where water damage had begun to threaten the elaborate rosettes and cornices. "Caldwell Restoration. I'm Sophia." "James Blackwell," he replied, extending his hand. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his palm slightly calloused in a way that surprised me. Not the hands of someone who spent all his time behind a desk. "My mother is on the fundraising committee. She's determined to save this architectural treasure from those who don't appreciate its significance." His impression of Eleanor was uncanny, capturing her precise diction and slightly nasal delivery. I laughed despite myself. "And do you appreciate its significance, Mr. Blackwell?" "James, please." He glanced up at the vaulted ceiling. "I appreciate that it would be a crime to let craftsmanship like this crumble because of neglect. Beyond that, I'm afraid my architectural knowledge is limited to knowing which buildings house the best restaurants." His self-deprecation was refreshing in a space where I'd grown accustomed to wealthy donors explaining my own field to me. I found myself relaxing, clipboard lowered to my side. "The plasterwork was completed in 1892 by Italian artisans brought specifically for this project," I told him, pointing to the most elaborate section above us. "Those rosettes contain over 30 individual components, each one hand-molded. You don't see that kind of detail anymore." "Because it's prohibitively expensive?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Partly cost, but mostly because the skills have been lost. There are maybe a dozen craftspeople in the country who could replicate that work authentically today." I didn't add that I had personally apprenticed with one of them for 3 years, learning techniques that dated back centuries. "And you're one of them?" His gaze was direct, assessing but not presumptuous. "I'm adequate," I replied with the modesty my grandmother had instilled in me. "My grandfather was better." "Caldwell," he said, making the connection. "Was he Martin Caldwell? The man who restored the governor's mansion after the fire?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "You knew my grandfather's work?" "My father has a photo of him meeting your grandfather at the reopening ceremony. He said he was the most unassuming genius he'd ever met. Showed up in work clothes while everyone else wore tuxedos." The memory made me smile. Grandpa had refused to dress up, claiming his hands were too calloused for fancy cufflinks. "That sounds like him." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, both looking up at the ceiling that represented my heritage more clearly than any family portrait. "I should let you work," James finally said, reluctance evident in his voice. "But perhaps I'll see you at the fundraiser tonight?" "I'm not attending," I replied. "Just assessing the restoration needs." "Have dinner with me instead," he suggested, the spontaneity seeming to surprise even him. I suddenly find myself with no interest in small talk with my mother's friends when I could be learning about Italian plasterwork techniques. His directness was disarming. No games, no pretense, just genuine interest. "I'm covered in plaster. Dust?" I said, gesturing to my practical work clothes. "Perfect," he replied with a smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made my pulse quicken. "I know a place where they don't mind a little dust." That was our beginning. Not at some society function or through carefully orchestrated introductions, as Eleanor later tried to suggest, but in a moment of genuine connection in a room full of history that I was working to preserve. The restaurant he took me to that evening was a small Italian place in a century-old building downtown, the kind of establishment where the owner knew James by name and didn't blink at my work clothes. Over handmade pasta and wine served in mismatched glasses, I learned that James had majored in literature before reluctantly entering the family finance business, that he still read poetry before bed, and that despite his tailored suits and Ivy League education, he changed his own oil and had renovated his first apartment himself. My mother was horrified, he told me, amusement dancing in his eyes. She couldn't understand why I wouldn't just hire someone. She sent a professional designer to fix it 3 times. I kept sending them away. "And your father?" I asked, twirling pasta around my fork. "Caught between his wife's social aspirations and his son's stubborn independence," James replied with a hint of sadness. "He wasn't always that way. There are photos of him in college, building furniture in a workshop, looking genuinely happy. Somewhere along the way, he surrendered his own identity to the Blackwell family image." I'd nodded, thinking of my own father's struggle, not with wealth, but with its absence. Forced into the mill when the restoration business faltered. His artist's hands gradually destroyed by machinery and chemicals, until he could barely hold a carving tool. "What about your family?" James had asked, seeming genuinely interested in a way few people ever were. Not just the polite questions about where I grew up, but real curiosity about who my people were, what shaped me. So I told him about Grandpa Martin, who could recreate any architectural detail by eye, about my grandmother who ran the business, operations with meticulous ledgers and unfailing instinct, about my mother who taught 3rd grade but spent summers helping restore historic schoolhouses as a family tradition. I told him about Mapleton's decline when the factories began closing, about my father's sacrifice taking mill work to keep me in college when restoration contracts dried up. "They died during my senior year," I said, the familiar ache returning as it always did. "Black ice on Route 27. They were coming home from seeing me in a university production of The Glass Menagerie. My mother had sewn my costume herself." James had reached across the table then, his hand covering mine without a word, offering simple presence rather than the awkward platitudes people usually attempted. We sat like that for several minutes, connected in the quiet acknowledgement of loss. What I didn't tell him that night, what would come later, was about the inheritance. The house with its century of memories and craftsmanship. The business that existed mostly on paper by then, its reputation intact, but its client list dwindled to almost nothing. The responsibility I felt to honor 4 generations of skilled hands and creative minds. Our courtship unfolded with a refreshing naturalness that stood in stark contrast to the structured social rituals Eleanor tried to impose once she learned of my existence. James and I moved between our different worlds with surprising ease. He seemed genuinely fascinated by my work sites, showing up in expensive shoes that soon became covered in construction dust as he examined the architectural details I was restoring. I discovered unexpected pleasure in the symphony performances and art exhibitions he introduced me to, experiences my parents would have loved but could rarely afford. 3 months into our relationship, on a Sunday afternoon as we sorted through boxes in my attic, James discovered a portfolio of my grandfather's original design sketches. He handled them with reverence, studying each pencil line, each notation. "These should be in a museum," he said, carefully turning the aged pages. "They belong here," I replied simply. "In the house where he drew them." James looked up from the portfolio, gazing around the attic with its carefully organized artifacts of my family's history. You really love this place, don't you? Not just as a house, but as... He searched for the right words. As the physical embodiment of my family's story, I finished for him. Every repair, every restoration, every improvement was done by someone whose blood runs in my veins. When I fix a loose floorboard or restore a piece of molding, I'm not just maintaining a structure. I'm continuing a conversation with my ancestors. He had looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret then, something like wonder mixed with concern. I've never been connected to any place like that, he admitted. The houses I grew up in were always perfect, professionally decorated, immaculately maintained, but they never felt like they contained any part of us. They were just expensive containers for our expensive things. 6 months into our relationship, James took me to the Blackwell family estate for Sunday dinner. I'd worn a simple blue dress, not expensive but well-made, my grandmother's pearls at my throat. As we pulled through the wrought iron gates and up the immaculate driveway, I felt a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with the imposing Georgian mansion and everything to do with the woman who ruled it. Eleanor Blackwell had greeted me. With perfect manners and calculating eyes, her assessment swift and dismissive as she took in my modest dress and simple jewelry. Within minutes, she had managed to inquire about my background, emphasizing the word as if it might involve a criminal record, my education, her eyebrows rising fractionally at the State University scholarship, and my little business, described as if it were a hobby shop selling handcrafted potpourri. Restoration, she'd repeated when James explained my profession. How fascinating. Richard, didn't we have someone repair the plaster in the sunroom last year? Perhaps it was Sophia's company? The pause suggested she was being generous in using the word company at all. Different firm, mother, James had replied with a tightness around his eyes I was coming to recognize. Sophia's company handles historically significant properties, museum-quality work. Of course, Eleanor had said with a thin smile. Well, we must keep you in mind should we encounter any historic emergencies. Dinner had proceeded with Eleanor, directing the conversation like an orchestra conductor, carefully ensuring that every topic highlighted the vast differences between my world and theirs. She referenced family vacations to destinations I'd only read about, dropping names of influential people as casually as seasonings into a recipe, and repeatedly touching on James's promising future at his father's firm. James has always had such a head for finance, she told me as if sharing a secret, even as a boy. Of course, with his education and connections, his future was never in question. The implied message was clear. James existed in a realm I could visit but never truly belonged to. As we were leaving, Eleanor had taken my hands in hers, her grip firm but her fingertips barely making contact, as if worried my middle-class status might be contagious. "It was lovely meeting you, Sophia," she'd said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "James has always had such eclectic tastes. It's refreshing to see him exploring beyond our usual circles." In the car afterward, James had apologized profusely. "She's not usually so—" "Yes, she is," I'd interrupted gently. "And it's okay. I've encountered the Eleanor Blackwells of the world before. They look at me and see only what I don't have, never what I do." "What you have," James had said, reaching for my hand, "is worth more than everything in that house." 2 weeks later, after a particularly successful restoration project brought in a significant payment, I decided to be completely honest with James about my financial situation. We sat on the porch swing of my family home, the home that, to a casual observer, might appear modest compared to the Blackwell estate, but that contained architectural details a discerning eye would value in the millions. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, nervousness making my voice softer than intended, "about my family and this house." James had listened without interruption as I explained about the generations of Caldwells who had not just worked, on historic properties but had invested in them, about my grandfather's foresight in purchasing buildings others had abandoned, about the trust that contained not just this property, but 3 others in the historic district. I showed him the business ledgers, the property deeds, the investment portfolios that had weathered recessions through careful conservative management. "So you're saying," he started, processing the information. "I'm saying that while I'm not in your family's financial league, I'm also not the struggling small business owner your mother imagines," I finished. "Caldwell Restoration was one of the premier firms in the region for decades. I'm rebuilding that reputation piece by piece." James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where heritage roses my grandmother had planted still bloomed against the ancient brick wall. "Do you know what I love most about you?" he finally asked, turning to face me. "You never once felt the need to tell me any of this. You didn't drop hints about your property holdings or investment portfolio. You let me see you, just you, without any of the trappings or credentials my world is so obsessed with." Then his expression had shifted, something like inspiration dawning. "What would you think about an experiment?" "What kind of experiment?" I'd asked, intrigued by the sudden spark in his eyes. "What if we don't correct my family's assumptions about your financial situation? What if we let them believe whatever they want to believe and see how they treat you?" I'd frowned slightly. "You want to test your family?" "I want them to have the opportunity to show their true character," he'd clarified. "If they knew about your properties and business, they'd treat you differently immediately. But would it be genuine respect? Or just another calculation?" I thought about it, remembering Eleanor's dismissive assessment, the way she'd looked at me as if cataloging, all the ways I didn't measure up to Blackwell standards. "They might never accept me," I pointed out. "Are you prepared for that?" James had taken my hands, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "If they can't accept you for who you are rather than what you own, then they're not the family I want them to be, and I'd need to know that." And so our experiment began, one that would last far longer and test us far more deeply than either of us could have imagined that evening on the porch swing. When James proposed 6 months later, it was in the garden behind my house, beneath the ancient oak tree where generations of Caldwells had carved their initials. He didn't present me with a massive diamond as Eleanor would have expected, but with my great-grandmother's ring that he'd noticed me admiring in a family photograph. A delicate sapphire surrounded by seed pearls that had been stored in my grandmother's jewelry box. He'd asked permission to use it from my aunt in Mapleton, the only family I had left. "I want to build a life with you, Sophia," he'd said, voice steady but eyes bright with emotion. "One that honors who we both are, not who anyone else thinks we should be." Eleanor's reaction to our engagement had been a masterclass in thinly veiled disapproval. "Well, this is certainly sudden," she'd said when James called with the news, her voice carrying clearly through the speakerphone. "I assume you've discussed the necessary legal protections. Your father's attorney can draw up an appropriate prenuptial agreement." James had met my eyes across the kitchen island, silently asking permission before responding. I had nodded, curious, to see how far the experiment would go. "Of course, Mother," he'd replied smoothly. "We'll take care of everything." We had, in fact, visited an attorney, my attorney, a woman who had handled the Caldwell family affairs for 20 years. The prenuptial agreement protected my assets far more than James's, a fact that would have shocked Eleanor into silence, had she known. The document clearly stated that the Victorian house would remain my sole property, along with the restoration business and family investments. Our wedding was small by Blackwell standards, 60 guests instead of the 300. Eleanor had initially proposed. We chose the garden of my family home rather than the country club where generations of Blackwells had celebrated their unions. My dress was from a small boutique rather than a designer salon, and the flowers came from my own garden, arranged by my mother's oldest friend. Throughout the planning process, Eleanor had made her disapproval clear in 1,000 small ways. The raised eyebrow at our choice of venue. Quaint, I suppose, if you prefer. Informal gatherings. The pained smile when I declined her offer to have the Blackwell family jeweler create a proper engagement ring. That little antique is charming, but hardly befitting a Blackwell bride. The thinly veiled relief when I agreed to let her handle the rehearsal dinner. At least one event should reflect appropriate standards. The night before our wedding, as I sat on the porch swing in the gentle May twilight, my aunt had joined me with 2 glasses of my grandmother's blackberry wine. "Your mother would have loved him," she said simply, handing me a glass. "Your grandfather might have tested his knowledge of wood species first, but he would have approved too." "And his family?" I asked, voicing the doubt I rarely allowed myself to acknowledge. "They think I'm beneath him." My aunt had snorted inelegantly, the family resemblance to my grandmother never stronger. "The Caldwells were building history in this town when the Blackwells were still counting other people's money," she said. "Not that it matters. What matters is that he sees you, really sees you." On our wedding day, as I prepared in my childhood, bedroom, a floral arrangement arrived from Eleanor. Elaborate white orchids clearly designed to outshine my simple garden bouquet, accompanied by a note that read, "Something suitable for a Blackwell bride. Welcome to the family." The message was clear. I was acceptable only to the extent that I could be molded to fit the Blackwell image. I placed the orchids in the guest bathroom and carried my bouquet of heirloom roses down the stairs to where James waited beneath. The oak tree, looking up at me with a clarity of love that required no family name, no social status, no approval from anyone but us. As we spoke our vows, I glanced once at Eleanor, seated stiffly in the front row in a designer suit that cost more than all the wedding decorations combined. Her expression was one of resigned tolerance, like someone enduring a delayed flight or a mediocre meal, an inconvenience to be weathered until normal service resumed. She had no way of knowing then that she sat on a chair my grandfather had carved by hand, on property that had been in my family since before her husband's grandfather made the first Blackwell fortune, witnessing a union that would ultimately challenge everything she thought she knew about worth and value. The experiment James had proposed had become our reality, one that would continue for 3 years until a Thanksgiving dinner, when the truth could no longer be contained behind politeness and patience. Marriage to James was unlike anything I had expected. While the Blackwell family dynamics continued to strain our relationship from the outside, within our home, my ancestral home, we created something genuine and nurturing. James thrived away from his family's watchful eyes, revealing a playful side Eleanor had systematically suppressed since childhood. I discovered the pleasure of sharing my family's legacy with someone who truly appreciated its significance beyond monetary value. The cracks began to appear 8 months into our marriage, on an unseasonably warm March evening when I returned home from a restoration site to find a strange car in our driveway. Through the front bay window, I could see James seated in the living room with a man I didn't recognize. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, an air of authority in his posture, even from a distance. When I entered, James rose quickly, an unusual tension in his expression. "Sophia, this is Lawrence Wingate. He's with Meridian Development." "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwell," Wingate said, extending a manicured hand. His smile was practiced, his eyes calculating beneath silver brows. "I was just discussing an exciting opportunity with your husband." Something in his tone immediately set me on edge. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, setting my work bag on the antique hall table. "The Mapleton Mills Revitalization Project," James explained, his voice carrying a forced brightness I'd never heard before. "Lawrence's firm is leading the effort." The name struck me like a physical blow. Mapleton Mills, the abandoned industrial complex where my father had worked himself into an early grave. The same complex that had been left to rot when the company moved operations overseas. devastating the town's economy and leaving hundreds of families, including mine, struggling to survive. We're transforming the site into luxury condominiums and boutique retail, Wingate explained with the smooth confidence of someone unused to opposition, completely reimagining the space while preserving select architectural elements for character. Preserving which elements? I asked, professional training overriding emotional response. Wingate waved a dismissive hand. The facade of the main building, perhaps a smokestack as a decorative feature. The interiors will be completely gutted, of course. No one wants to live with 19th century industrial design. Actually, many people do, I corrected automatically. The timber supports, alone in the main mill, are irreplaceable old-growth pine. The brickwork is distinctive to that period of industrial architecture. Wingate's smile tightened. Yes, well, we have our own preservation consultants who'll determine what's viable. Why are you discussing this with my husband? I asked directly, the sense of something fundamentally wrong growing stronger. James mentioned your connection to Mapleton, Wingate replied. Sentimentality aside, this project represents an exceptional investment opportunity. Properties in post-industrial towns like Mapleton are undervalued, making the potential returns substantial. Returns for whom? I pressed. For investors like James, Wingate said, a hint of impatience seeping through his polished veneer. The Blackwell name adds considerable legitimacy to our investor list. I turned to James, whose discomfort was now plainly visible. You're investing in this project? We're discussing possibilities, James replied carefully. Nothing's decided. Actually, Wingate interjected, removing documents from his leather portfolio, we do have preliminary agreements for your review. We're moving quickly to secure the necessary investors before proceeding with demolition next month. Demolition? The word hit like ice water. The mills are being demolished? Just the non-essential structures, Wingate clarified. The outbuildings, worker housing, that sort of thing. Those outbuildings include the original pattern house where master craftsmen created the molds for machine parts, I said, my voice rising. The worker housing is one of the few intact examples of 1880s industrial community planning left in the state. Wingate's expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Blackwell, with all due respect, these are dilapidated structures that have been vacant for decades. They're hazards, not historical treasures. With all due respect, Mr. Wingate, I'm a professional architectural preservationist. Those buildings tell the story of American industrial development and the people who made it possible. People, like my father, who worked in that mill until his hands bled to keep a roof over our heads after the owners abandoned it, and their responsibilities to the community. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Wingate glanced at James as if expecting him to control his emotional wife. James looked torn, caught between loyalties. Perhaps we should continue this discussion another time, Wingate finally said, gathering his materials with practiced efficiency. There's nothing to continue, I replied firmly. My husband won't be investing in the destruction of Mapleton's heritage. Wingate's professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. I believe that's for Mr. Blackwell to decide. The investment paperwork only requires his signature after all. The implication stung more than I expected, that my opinion was irrelevant, that financial decisions belonged to my husband regardless of my feelings or expertise. It felt like Eleanor speaking through Wingate's expensive suit and practiced smile. I'll walk you out, James said quietly to Wingate, the tension in his shoulders visible as they left the room. I remained standing in the living room, surrounded by the carefully preserved history of my family, feeling suddenly like a stranger in my own home. Through the window, I watched James and Wingate speaking beside the car, their conversation appearing intense despite their controlled gestures. When James returned, I was waiting in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. What was that about? I asked without preamble. James sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his tell when feeling cornered. Meridian approached me at work last week. When I mentioned my wife was from Mapleton, they saw it as a perfect alignment. They thought you'd be pleased about the revitalization. Revitalization? I echoed incredulously. They're gutting buildings that tell the story of generations of workers, including my family, and turning them into luxury apartments for wealthy people who've never set foot in Mapleton. How is that revitalization? The town needs economic development, Sophia? The tax base has been collapsing for years. And who benefits from that development? Not the families who've struggled there since the mills closed. They'll be priced out of their own town. James's expression hardened slightly. This is why I hesitated to mention it. I knew you'd react emotionally, rather than seeing the practical aspects. Emotional? The word landed like a slap. Is that what you think this is? My professional assessment of historical significance is emotional, but your family's financial opportunism is practical. That's not fair, James protested. This investment makes sense regardless of family connections. Then why did Wingate emphasize the Blackwell name? Why come to our home rather than your office? This has Eleanor written all over it. James flinched slightly, confirming my suspicion. Mother mentioned the project might interest me. She knows some of the principals at Meridian. Of course she does, I said bitterly. And I suppose she also knows how much I care about Mapleton. She might have mentioned your attachment to the town. The full picture suddenly came into devastating focus. She's using this project to drive a wedge between us, I said slowly. She found something she knew would force you to choose between your family's financial interests and your wife's values. Not everything is about you and Mother, James replied, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Isn't it? Since the day we met, she's been looking for evidence that I married you for money, that I couldn't possibly love you for yourself. What better proof than opposing a lucrative family investment because of sentimentality about my hometown? James was silent. For several moments, conflict evident in his expression. What if the project could be modified? He finally asked. What if more of the historic elements could be preserved? Would you consider supporting it then? The question revealed how little he understood. This isn't about negotiating which parts of Mapleton's history deserve to survive based on a developer's profit margin, I said quietly. It's about recognizing that some things shouldn't be for sale. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving a subtle but unmistakable distance between us that hadn't existed before. Over the following weeks, that distance grew as James began working later hours and attending more family functions without me. The Mapleton project was never explicitly mentioned again, but its shadow lingered over our marriage like a storm cloud on the horizon. Then came the morning I discovered the investment documents in James's desk drawer, partially completed with his signature on the preliminary agreement. I hadn't been snooping. I'd been searching for stamps to mail a client proposal. But there they were, hidden beneath everyday office supplies, as if James was ashamed but not ashamed enough to refuse. I remember standing in our home office, holding the evidence of my husband's decision, feeling something fundamental shift within our relationship. It wasn't just about Mapleton anymore. It was about trust, about values, about whether James was truly my partner or still his mother's son. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I drove to Mapleton the next day, ostensibly to visit my aunt but really to see the mills one last time before development began. The massive brick structures stood silent against the spring sky, windows broken but walls still proud, a testament to the craftsmanship of another era. Mrs. Chen. The unexpected greeting came from Frank Delaney, my father's old friend from the mill, now in his 70s, but still walking the perimeter of the abandoned complex each morning as if reporting for a shift that had ended decades ago. I heard they're finally doing something with the old place, he said, nodding toward the main building. Turning it into fancy apartments, they say. That's the plan, I replied, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Frank studied my expression, with the discernment of someone who'd known me since childhood. You don't sound pleased about it. They're destroying most of it, Frank. All that craftsmanship, all that history, gone to build luxury homes for people who never worked a day in a place like this. He was quiet for a moment, weathered hands, resting on the fence that separated us from the property. You know, your father used to talk about this place differently than the rest of us. We just saw a job, hard work for decent pay. He saw the beauty in it, the massive beams, the way the light came through those big windows, the pattern of the bricks. Even with his hands ruined from the chemicals, he'd point out details none of us had ever noticed. Tears pricked at my eyes. He wanted to be a restoration, carpenter like Grandpa. The mill was supposed to be temporary. Frank nodded. He had the eye for it. I remember when they were tearing down the old pattern house roof to replace it with cheap metal. Your dad salvaged those hand-carved corbels, said they were too fine to throw away. He gave them to me, I said softly. They're supporting the bookcase in my living room now. Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. See? He found a way to preserve what mattered. He gestured toward the mill complex. Maybe that's the way to think about this. Not everything can be saved, but the pieces that matter most, those can find new life. I drove home with Frank's words echoing in my mind, a new determination, forming. If I couldn't stop the development entirely, perhaps I could shape it, guide it in a direction that honored rather than erased Mapleton's industrial heritage. When I arrived home, I found Eleanor's sleek, luxury sedan parked in our driveway. Through the front window, I could see her and James in intense conversation, their body language suggesting conflict rather than casual family discussion. I entered quietly, catching Eleanor mid-sentence. Simply can't understand why you'd hesitate over something so clearly beneficial to the family's interests. Your father is counting on your participation. It's complicated, Mother, James replied, tension evident in his voice. Only because you're making it complicated, Eleanor countered. This reluctance isn't like you, James. It's her influence, isn't it? I cleared my throat, announcing my presence. Eleanor turned with practiced composure, her surprise at being overheard concealed behind a polished smile. Sophia, dear, she said smoothly. I was just discussing a family investment matter with James. The Mapleton development, I stated rather than asked. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, a tremendous opportunity. Though I understand you might have reservations, given your background. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Background, pronounced as if referring to an unfortunate medical condition. James looked uncomfortable, but didn't contradict his mother. I have professional reservations about destroying historically significant architecture, I clarified, and personal concerns about a project that seems designed to exploit rather than support the community. Eleanor's laugh was dismissive. My dear, progress always requires change. Sentimentality about old buildings can't stand in the way of economic development. Is it progress to erase the physical evidence of working-class history? I challenged. To replace craftsmanship that can't be replicated with disposable luxury? These philosophical questions are fascinating, Eleanor replied with faux politeness, but ultimately irrelevant to the financial considerations. The family has already committed to the initial investment phase. I turned to James, disbelief washing over me. The family has committed? When did this happen? James couldn't meet my eyes. Father signed the primary documents yesterday. My portion is still under consideration. Under consideration? I repeated incredulously. You told me you understood my concerns. You said you wouldn't proceed without discussing it further. Eleanor intervened smoothly. James understands that family financial decisions sometimes require difficult choices. The Blackwell portfolio demands certain obligations. This isn't about portfolios, I said, struggling to maintain my composure. It's about integrity, about honoring commitments. not just financial ones. Sophia? James began, his tone placating in a way that made my skin crawl. Don't, I interrupted. Just don't. I turned back to Eleanor, suddenly seeing with painful clarity the manipulation at work. You orchestrated this entire situation, didn't you? Found a project you knew would force exactly this confrontation. Eleanor's expression remained impassive, but a flash of something, satisfaction, perhaps, flickered in her eyes. I simply identified an investment opportunity that benefits the family. If that creates tension in your marriage, perhaps it reveals incompatibilities that were already present. The calculated cruelty of her strategy took my breath away. This wasn't just about money or even about control. It was about proving that James would ultimately choose Blackwell priorities over his wife's values. I need air, I said abruptly, turning toward the door before either of them could respond. I spent hours walking the historic district, past buildings my grandfather had helped restore, landmarks that told the story of our town just as surely as the Mapleton Mills told the core story of its community. By the time I returned home, Eleanor was gone, and James was waiting in the kitchen, 2 untouched glasses of wine on the counter between us. I'm sorry, he said immediately. Mother shouldn't have ambushed you like that. This isn't about your mother's tactics, I replied wearily. It's about the fact that you made a decision that profoundly affects something I care deeply about, then hid it from me. I didn't make a final decision, he countered. I'm still considering options. I found the signed preliminary agreement in your desk, James. His expression fell, guilt replacing defensiveness. I was going to tell you. When? After demolition. Began? After it was too late for me to have any voice in the matter? It's not that simple, Sophia. The family's investment strategy is interconnected. Pulling out of one project affects positions in others. Father's already committed significant capital based on my anticipated participation. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw for the first time how deeply the Blackwell expectations were embedded in his identity, despite his protests to the contrary. So your father's expectations outweigh your wife's deeply held values? That's not fair, he protested. What's not fair is pretending this is just about business, I said quietly. Your mother has been trying to prove since the day we met that your loyalty ultimately belongs to the Blackwell name, not to me. And you're proving her right. The pain in his eyes was genuine, but so was the hesitation, the calculation of family, allegiance against marital harmony. He was caught in the web Eleanor had so carefully constructed, a trap whose effectiveness depended entirely on James's inability to fully break free from Blackwell expectations. I need time to think, I finally said, when it became clear that James couldn't or wouldn't make the definitive choice I needed. I'm going to stay with Diane for a few days. Diane was my closest friend, the one person who knew the full truth about our experiment with the Blackwells. Sophia, please, James said, reaching for my hand. We can work through this. Can we? I asked simply. 3 years into our marriage, and you're still letting your mother manipulate both of us. What does that say about our future? I packed a small bag while James watched helplessly from the doorway of our bedroom. As I prepared to leave, I paused at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by the history my family had preserved through generations of careful stewardship. This house has stood for over a century, I said softly, because each generation understood their responsibility to those who came before and those who would come after. That's what heritage means, James. Not assets to be leveraged, but legacies to be honored. The 3 days I spent at Diane's apartment became a week, then 2. James called daily, his messages gradually shifting from defensive explanations to thoughtful reflection. On the 10th day, he texted a simple question that suggested he might finally understand. What if we could save the mills instead of destroying them? I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location, the small cafe near the university where we'd had our fourth date. When I arrived, James was already waiting, not just with coffee, but with a thick folder of documents I didn't recognize. "Before you say anything," he began as I slid into the seat across from him, "I want you to see these." He opened the folder to reveal architectural drawings, preservation assessments, and financial projections for what appeared to be an alternative development plan for the Mapleton Mills. Rather than luxury condominiums, the plans showed a mixed-use restoration that maintained the historical integrity of the complex while creating affordable housing, community spaces, and workshops for artisans and small manufacturers. "What is this?" I asked, paging through the meticulously prepared proposal. "A different vision," James replied. "One that honors Mapleton's history rather than erasing it." I looked up, confused. "How?" "Meridian's already moving forward with demolition." "Not anymore," James said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Not since the Blackwell Group withdrew all financial support and convinced 3 other major investors to follow suit. Your family pulled out? But your father had already committed." "Not the family," James clarified. "Me, the Blackwell Group, is my investment entity, separate from my father's holdings. I established it after we married." Understanding dawned slowly. "You leveraged your own financial position against your family's." James nodded. "And it worked. Without our participation, Meridian couldn't secure the necessary capital to proceed on schedule. That gave me time to develop this alternative with a preservation-focused development group." "Your mother must be furious," I said, still processing the magnitude of what he'd done. "Livid," he confirmed with a grim smile. "She called it financial sabotage and family betrayal, among other things not worth repeating." "And your father?" "Surprisingly open to the alternative plan once I walked him through the numbers. The preservation tax credits actually make the financial returns competitive with Meridian's proposal, just distributed over a longer time frame with more sustainable community benefits." I studied the man sitting across from me, familiar yet somehow changed. For the first time since I'd known him, James looked unburdened by the weight of Blackwell expectations. "Why did you do this?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Because you were right," he said simply. "About the mills, about my mother's manipulation, about my inability to fully break free from family expectations. I had to make a choice that proved, to you, to myself, and yes, to my mother, where my true priorities lie." His hand reached across the table for mine, a gesture of reconnection that felt both familiar and new. "I want to be your partner, Sophia, not just your husband. That means standing with you, not just living alongside you." As I placed my hand in his, I felt something shift, not just between us, but within the experiment we'd begun 3 years earlier. What had started as a test of the Blackwell's character had evolved into a test of our marriage's foundations. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps we needed to end the charade, to let the truth about my family's legacy emerge not as a weapon against Eleanor's prejudice, but as an honest declaration of who we truly were. "There's something I think we need to do," I said, squeezing James's hand. "Something long overdue." "What's that?" he asked. "Tell your family the truth. All of it. Not to prove a point or win an argument, but because living authentically means not hiding parts of ourselves, even the parts that might surprise a Blackwell." James's slow smile told me he understood exactly what I meant. "Thanksgiving is next week," he observed. "Mother's already planning the annual dinner at our house." "Perfect timing," I replied, a plan already forming in my mind. After all, what better occasion for revealing uncomfortable truths than a family holiday? What neither of us could have anticipated was just how dramatic that revelation would become, or how completely it would transform not just Eleanor's perception of me, but the entire power dynamic of the Blackwell family. The week before Thanksgiving. Unfolded with deliberate purpose as I prepared for the confrontation 3 years in the making. This would not be an impulsive revelation born of anger, but a carefully orchestrated disclosure designed to reclaim my identity after years of Eleanor's subtle erosion. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" James asked as we sat in my office, reviewing documents on a crisp Sunday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the leaded glass windows, highlighting the collection of papers, photographs, and property records spread across my grandfather's mahogany desk. "I've never been more certain," I replied, organizing the materials into a leather portfolio. "The experiment has run its course. It's revealed exactly what you suspected about your family's values, and forced us to examine our own." James nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of apprehension and relief. "Mother will never forgive us for deceiving her." "She might not," I acknowledged. "But this was never about gaining Eleanor's forgiveness. It was about understanding whether she could accept me without the trappings of wealth and status. She's had 3 years to see me as a person worthy of respect, regardless of my background. She chose differently. The Blackwell family's perception of me had been built on a foundation of assumptions Eleanor had carefully cultivated. That I was a social climber from a declining industrial town, that my restoration business was a quaint hobby supported by James's generosity, that our home was a gift from the Blackwell fortune to a woman who couldn't possibly have acquired such property on her own merits. Now it was time to dismantle those assumptions, not with anger or vindictiveness, but with irrefutable evidence of a heritage just as meaningful as the Blackwell legacy, if less flamboyantly displayed. Monday morning, I made my first strategic move. Rather than visiting a restoration site as planned, I drove to the offices of Sullivan and Winters, the law firm that had handled the Caldwell family affairs for generations. Regina Winters greeted me with the warmth of long acquaintance, her silver hair twisted into an elegant knot, her handshake firm despite her 70-plus years. "Sophia, what a pleasant surprise," she said, ushering me into her office overlooking the town square. "Is this about the Westmore Library project?" "Not exactly," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. "I need to make some changes to our family trust documentation, and I have a rather unusual request." For the next hour, Regina listened attentively as I outlined my plan, her expression shifting from surprise to thoughtful consideration, and finally to something approaching admiration. "In 30 years of practice, I've never prepared quite this sort of presentation," she remarked, making careful notes. "But I understand your reasoning, and the documents certainly tell a compelling story. Will you be able to have everything ready by Wednesday?" I asked. Regina's smile was confident. "For Margaret Caldwell's granddaughter? Absolutely. Your grandmother was one of my first clients when I joined this firm. She'd thoroughly approve of what you're doing, by the way." I left the law office with a weight lifted, the first piece of my plan securely in place. Grandma Margaret had indeed been a formidable woman who believed in standing one's ground without sacrificing dignity. "Never raise your voice when raising an eyebrow will suffice," she'd often told me. "But when the moment demands, make sure your evidence is impeccable." Tuesday brought my second preparation, a visit to the bank where my family had done business, since the building itself was constructed in 1897. The current manager, Thomas Reed, was the son of my grandfather's fishing companion, the connection representing the kind of small-town continuity the Blackwells would never understand, but implicitly benefited from through their association with me. "We can certainly provide verification of the property transfers and original purchase dates," Thomas assured me after I explained my request. "The bank's archives contain the mortgage records for your family home dating back to its construction, along with the subsequent title clearances. I'd also like documentation of the restoration business's banking history," I added, "particularly the periods of growth following my taking over management." Thomas nodded, typing notes into his computer. "That's easily done. The Caldwell account is one of our oldest continuous business relationships. Would you like the records showing the transition from your grandfather to your management with the comparative growth figures? That would be perfect, I confirmed. And if possible, could you include a formal letter verifying the business's current financial standing and creditworthiness? Of course, Thomas replied. Though if you don't mind my asking, is everything all right? These aren't the usual documents someone requests unless they're defending against an audit or legal challenge. I smiled reassuringly. Nothing so serious. Let's just say I'm preparing for a family presentation that requires unimpeachable documentation. By Wednesday afternoon, both sets of documents had been delivered to my office. Regina's elegant leather portfolio containing the trust documents, property deeds, and historical valuation assessments. Thomas's more formal banking records sealed in the institution's distinctive blue folders with gold embossing. Together, they presented an irrefutable chronology of the Caldwell family's quiet but substantial financial foundation. My third strategic element required more delicate handling. After considerable thought, I placed a call to Charlotte, James's sister, with whom I'd maintained a cordial, if distant relationship over the years. Of all the Blackwells, she seemed the least invested in Eleanor's narrative about me, though she'd never openly contradicted her mother either. Sophia? This is unexpected, Charlotte answered, her tone curious rather than unwelcoming. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, I began, measuring my words carefully. I have an unusual favor to ask regarding Thanksgiving. Mother's already ordered the catering, Charlotte replied quickly. She didn't think you'd want to handle the cooking this year after everything. The everything encompassed the Mapleton Mills conflict and its aftermath, my temporary separation from James, his defiance of family investment strategy, and our eventual reconciliation that remained a source of tension at Blackwell family gatherings. Actually, I'll be cooking as usual, I corrected her gently. But what I wanted to ask was more personal. Would you be willing to bring your children's baby albums on Thursday? The request was met with puzzled silence. Their baby albums? Whatever for? I'd like to show them some photographs that might interest them. Family history from both sides. It's important to me that they understand their full heritage, not just the Blackwell narrative. Charlotte hesitated before responding. Is this about Mother? Because if you're planning some sort of confrontation during Thanksgiving dinner— Not a confrontation, I assured her, though the line between confrontation and revelation seemed increasingly thin. Just an opportunity for honest conversation about family history, something that's overdue. To my surprise, Charlotte's tone softened with what sounded like understanding. You know, James has been different lately. More centered, more like the brother I grew up with before he became absorbed into Father's business. I think that's your influence. We influence each other, I replied, touched by the unexpected acknowledgement. I'll bring the albums, Charlotte agreed. And Sophia? Whatever you're planning, good luck. The final element of preparation was perhaps the most challenging, preparing our home itself for the revelation to come. For 3 years, I had allowed Eleanor to believe that the historical details and architectural elements that made our house special were either James's additions or happy accidents of a property he had selected. Now I needed to subtly highlight the connections to my family without revealing my hand prematurely. I spent Thursday morning polishing the silver that had been in my family for generations, the serving pieces Eleanor had always assumed were wedding gifts from James's side of the family. I arranged fresh flowers in my grandmother's crystal vases, positioning them strategically throughout the downstairs rooms. In the dining room, I set the table with my family's heirloom china, the pattern Eleanor had once dismissed as quaintly traditional when she believed James had purchased it to humor my more modest tastes. Most significantly, I removed the photographs I'd kept tucked away in albums and displayed them prominently on the piano and side tables, my grandfather standing proudly before the house when it was newly built, my parents on their wedding day, posed on the very porch steps the Blackwells would ascend tomorrow. My grandmother in her garden, cultivating the heritage roses that still bloomed against the south wall. James watched these preparations with growing awareness of their significance. "You're reclaiming the space," he observed as I hung my grandfather's original architectural sketches of the house in the front hallway. "I'm restoring what should never have been hidden," I corrected him. "This isn't about ownership in the way your mother thinks of it. It's about honoring the truth of who built this life and this home." That evening, as we reviewed our strategy one final time, James surprised me with an unexpected addition to our documentation. He placed a leather-bound folder beside my carefully arranged materials. "What's this?" I asked, opening it to find financial statements and investment records I didn't recognize. "My contribution," he replied. "Full disclosure of my financial position before and after our marriage. Proof that, contrary to Mother's implications, my portfolio has grown substantially under your influence. The conservative investment approach you advocated has outperformed Father's more aggressive strategy by nearly 11% over the past 2 years. I studied the documents with growing appreciation for their significance. You're refuting the gold digger narrative from both directions." "Exactly," James confirmed. "Not only did I not rescue you from financial hardship, but your financial acumen has actively benefited me. Mother has been wrong on every possible level." We fell asleep that night with an unusual combination of tension and peace, the anticipation of conflict balanced against the freedom that would come with finally living authentically in our own home. Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight gleaming on the first frost of the season. I rose early to begin cooking, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of preparing dishes from both our family's traditions. My grandmother's maple pumpkin pie alongside the cranberry relish Eleanor had grudgingly admitted was acceptable last year. James joined me in the kitchen, taking responsibility for the turkey as he had each year of our marriage. We worked in companionable focus, the unspoken awareness of what was to come lending purpose to each small task. "Whatever happens today," James said as he expertly carved fresh herbs for the stuffing, "I want you to know that choosing you, truly choosing you, not just marrying you, has been the best decision of my life." I paused in my pie preparation, flour dusting my hands as I turned to face him. "Even if it changes your relationship with your family forever?" His expression was resolute. "Especially then. Because it means I've finally become my own person, not just a vessel for Blackwell ambitions." We shared a brief, flour-dusted kiss before returning to our preparations, strengthened by the certainty that whatever storms Eleanor might unleash, we would weather them together. At precisely 2 o'clock, the first car arrived, Charlotte and T. Her husband David with their 2 children, bearing the requested photo albums along with a bottle of wine and flowers. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly as she entered the house, her gaze lingering on the newly displayed family photographs. "I don't think I've seen these before," she commented, studying a picture of my grandfather with his restoration crew in front of the town hall. "They've been in albums until now," I explained, accepting her hostess gift. I decided it was time to properly display our family history. Charlotte's emphasis on "our" wasn't lost on me, nor was the thoughtful glance she exchanged with James. Perhaps she had suspected something of our arrangement all along. Richard and Eleanor arrived precisely at 2:30, Eleanor sweeping into the house with her customary air of ownership and assessment. Her gaze traveled critically over the Thanksgiving decorations, the table setting, the subtle changes to the decor that emphasized the home's historical character. "You've been busy," she observed, handing her coat to James with practiced nonchalance. "Though I still think professional catering would have been more sensible given the tensions of recent months." "Cooking family recipes is important to me," I replied evenly. "It's how we maintain connections across generations." Eleanor's smile was brittle. How charmingly sentimental. Though I suppose when one's family traditions are more limited, one clings to what's available, And there it was, the first subtle jab of the day, the implication that my heritage was somehow less substantial, less worthy of preservation than the Blackwell legacy. In previous years, I would have let it pass, swallowing the insult for the sake of harmony. Today, I simply smiled, secure in the knowledge that such dismissals would soon be revealed for the ignorant assumptions they were. Some family legacies are less about public recognition and more about lasting impact, I replied. Quality often speaks for itself without requiring announcement. A flash of irritation crossed Eleanor's perfectly composed features before she turned away to greet Charlotte and the children, her voice immediately shifting to the warm, indulgent tone she reserved for family members she didn't view as interlopers. We moved into the dining room. I caught James watching me with a mixture of pride and nervousness. The stage was set, the players assembled, the documentation discreetly placed in my office for the moment when mere words would require irrefutable support. After 3 years of allowing Eleanor to define me according to her prejudices, I was hours away from reclaiming my narrative. Richard, who had remained characteristically quiet during the initial greetings, paused before the newly displayed photograph of my grandfather outside our home circa 1935. Remarkable resemblance to this property, he observed with genuine interest. Was this a family member outside a similar house? Very similar, I agreed, using the opening to begin laying groundwork. My grandfather had a particular appreciation for Victorian architecture. He dedicated his career to preserving historical properties throughout the region. Eleanor joined us, champagne flute already in hand. Yes, Sophia's family had some connection to the building trades, I believe. Maintenance work of some kind. Restoration, James corrected firmly. Sophia's grandfather founded Caldwell Historic Restoration. He was renowned in preservation circles. Eleanor's dismissive wave minimized the accomplishment. A trade skill can be quite valuable, of course, though hardly comparable to establishing a financial institution that has shaped regional development for generations. I exchanged a glance with James, both of us recognizing Eleanor's transparent attempt to reassert Blackwell's superiority. The comparison she was drawing would soon become far more complicated than she could possibly anticipate. Different forms of legacy, I replied mildly. Though it's interesting to consider what truly lasts. Financial instruments change hands. Investments rise and fall, but the physical structures that define our communities, when properly preserved, can stand for centuries. Philosophy at the dinner table, Eleanor commented with forced lightness. How avant-garde. Shall we be seated? The children are getting restless. As we gathered around the table, my family's table, though Eleanor had always treated it as if James had acquired it for our home, I felt a strange calm descend. The carefully maintained facade of the past 3 years was hours from crumbling. Yet instead of anxiety, I felt only the certainty that truth, however uncomfortable, would ultimately prove liberating. James caught my eye across the autumn centerpiece I'd created from materials gathered from our property: bittersweet vines, late hydrangeas, and sprigs of copper beech. His slight nod conveyed both reassurance and solidarity. Whatever happened when the truth emerged, we would face it together, on ground that had belonged to my family for generations before Eleanor Blackwell ever set her disapproving foot upon. If the turkey was carved, the sides passed, the ritual of Thanksgiving dinner proceeding with superficial normalcy, overlaying the currents of tension and anticipation. Eleanor dominated the conversation as usual, steering topics toward Blackwell achievements, social connections, and the family's historical prominence in the community. Each subtle reinforcement of status hierarchy was delivered with practiced precision, building toward what I now recognized would be the inevitable moment when my supposed financial dependence would become the target of her disapproval. I didn't have to wait long. James tells me your little restoration project at the library is nearing completion, Eleanor remarked during a momentary lull in conversation. How fortunate that his position allows you to pursue these creative interests. She turned to Charlotte with a conspiratorial smile. Not all husbands would be so indulgent of a wife's hobbies, especially in this economy. The designation of my professional work as a hobby requiring James's financial indulgence was precisely the opening I had anticipated. The moment had arrived, earlier than expected, but perfectly timed. I set down my fork deliberately, napkin, smoothed across my lap as I met Eleanor's gaze directly. Actually, Eleanor, I've been meaning to correct some misconceptions you seem to have about my restoration work, and about my financial situation more generally. Eleanor's expression registered polite disinterest, unaware that the conversation was about to fundamentally alter her understanding of the power dynamics she had so confidently manipulated for 3 years. "Oh?" she replied with the faintest arch of her perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Do enlighten us, dear." I glanced at James, who nodded almost imperceptibly, his expression conveying both support and the slightest hint of anticipation for what was about to unfold. "I think it's finally time we discussed who really owns this house," I said calmly, the words landing in the center of the Thanksgiving table like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge to 3 years of condescension and carefully cultivated misunderstanding. "Who really owns this house?" Eleanor repeated, her voice carrying the practiced patience one might use with a child making an absurd claim. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, dear. James purchased this property before your marriage." She glanced at her son with a tight smile. "Although I believe it was technically part of your prenuptial agreement that Sophia would receive some equity after 5 years of marriage." The condescension in her tone, the absolute certainty of her superior knowledge, might have intimidated me once. Now it simply confirmed the necessity of what was about to happen. "That's not actually correct," I replied, my voice steady. "James never purchased this house. He couldn't have. It wasn't for sale." Richard Blackwell set down his wineglass, his attention suddenly focused. Unlike his wife, he had built his financial empire on careful assessment of facts rather than social assumptions. "I don't follow, Sophia. The property transaction was part of the financial disclosures during your prenuptial negotiations." "The disclosure was accurate," James interjected, "but incomplete by design. I never claimed to have purchased the house, merely that the property had been properly accounted for in our financial arrangements." Eleanor's expression sharpened, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into her perfectly composed features. "What exactly are you saying?" I rose from my chair, the movement deliberate and unhurried. "If you'll give me a moment, I think it's time to clear up several misconceptions." I walked to my office adjoining the dining room, returning with the leather portfolio Regina Winters had prepared. The weight of it in my hands felt significant. Not just the physical documents, but the history and truth they represented. "This house has been in my family for 4 generations, I stated, removing the original deed and placing it on the table. "It was built by my great-grandfather Thomas Caldwell in 1892 and has passed down through the Caldwell line ever since." Eleanor stared at the document, disbelief evident in her expression. "That's impossible. James told you what we agreed he would tell you," I interrupted gently. "Or rather, what we agreed he wouldn't correct when you made assumptions about our financial circumstances." Charlotte leaned forward, studying the aged document with genuine curiosity. "You've owned this house since before you met James?" "I inherited it after my parents' deaths during my senior year of college," I confirmed, "along with the restoration business my grandfather founded." "But—" Eleanor's voice faltered, her eyes darting between the document and her son. "Why would you hide this? What possible reason?" "Because we wanted to see if you could accept me for who I am, not what I own," I said simply. "Whether you could value me as a person worthy of your son's love, regardless of my perceived financial status." Richard's brow furrowed in concentration as the implications became clear. "You conducted a social experiment on us?" "Not initially," James explained, his tone conciliatory but firm. When we first met, Sophia didn't mention her inheritance because that's not who she is. Her identity isn't wrapped up in her possessions or family name. By the time she told me about her financial situation, we'd already fallen in love. But by then, Mother, you had made it abundantly clear what you thought of Sophia's background. He continued, looking directly at Eleanor. Your comments about her humble beginnings and assumptions about her motivations for dating me created a dynamic where revealing the truth seemed pointless. You'd already decided who she was. Eleanor's face had drained of color, her usual composure fracturing visibly. So this entire time, 3 years of marriage, you've been deliberately deceiving us, allowing me to believe. She stopped abruptly, perhaps realizing the damning nature of whatever would come next. Allowing you to believe I was a gold digger. Who married James for his money? I finished for her. Yes. Because that's what you were determined to believe, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. I removed another document from the portfolio, the business valuation of Caldwell Historic Restoration. My company currently employs 17 people and has a project backlog extending 18 months. The Westmore Library restoration you dismissed as my little project is a $2.4 million contract that my firm won in competitive bidding against 3 larger companies. Eleanor's gaze fixed on the financial figures, her expression shifting from shock to calculation. The wheels were visibly turning as she reassessed 3 years of interactions through this new lens. And the prenuptial agreement? Richard asked, the businessman in him asserting precedence over the father-in-law. James smiled slightly. Drafted by Sophia's attorney, primarily to protect her assets from any potential Blackwell family claims. My financial position has actually improved considerably since our marriage, largely due to Sophia's more conservative investment approach. I don't understand, Charlotte interjected, looking between her brother and me. If you owned all this already, why live as if you didn't? Why put up with Mother's assumptions for 3 years? It was a fair question, perhaps the central question that had plagued our marriage during the most difficult moments of maintaining the facade. Because I wanted to know if I was marrying into a family that could see value beyond balance sheets, I explained. Whether the Blackwell name represented genuine character or just wealth and social position. And did we pass this test of yours? Eleanor asked, her voice carrying an edge of both humiliation and anger. I met her gaze directly. Some of you showed moments of seeing beyond your preconceptions. Richard has occasionally engaged with my ideas on their merits. Charlotte has made efforts to know me as a person. But you, Eleanor? You have spent 3 years consistently reinforcing your belief that without Blackwell money, I would have no value or place in this family. The unvarnished truth hung in the air between us. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, perhaps for the first time in her adult life finding herself without a ready response. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. I'm not sure I understand the purpose of this revelation today. Why now? Because living authentically matters, James answered. Because maintaining this pretense has put a strain on our marriage that we're no longer willing to accept. And because Mother's continuous efforts to undermine Sophia based on financial assumptions need to stop. I returned to the portfolio, extracting the banking records Thomas Reed had prepared. This house has been fully owned by my family since 1927, when my grandfather paid off the original mortgage. The restoration business has operated continuously since 1943, with clients throughout the Northeast. I placed the papers before Eleanor, whose rigid posture betrayed the effort required to maintain her composure. The annual revenue of my company exceeds James's salary at his father's firm. The trust that manages my family's property holdings generates investment income that would be considered substantial, even by Blackwell standards. So, I've been wrong, Eleanor said stiffly, her fingers tracing the edge of the documents without actually engaging with their content. Is that what you want me to say? That I misjudged your financial situation? This isn't about finances, I replied quietly. It's about character. About how quickly you dismissed me based on assumptions. About my background, and how thoroughly you've tried to make James choose between his wife and his family name. Eleanor's eyes flashed. I have only ever wanted what's best for my son. What you've wanted, James corrected gently, is for me to marry someone who reinforces your social position. Sophia threatened that because you believed she came from a world you consider beneath us. The irony is that her family has been quietly building and preserving the architectural character of this community for generations, while ours has primarily extracted profit from it. Richard winced at the characterization, though he didn't contradict his son. Charlotte watched the exchange with growing understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. The Mills project, she said suddenly. That wasn't just about an investment opportunity, was it, Mother? It was about proving Sophia would oppose family interests for sentimental reasons. Eleanor's silence was confirmation enough. Except the sentimental reasons turned out to be professional expertise about historical preservation and community impact, I added. The alternative development plan James created is now being hailed as a model for sustainable rehabilitation of industrial spaces. I turned to the children who had been watching the adult drama unfold with wide eyes. This is why I asked your mother to bring the family albums today. I wanted you to see that history isn't just about famous names or big fortunes. Sometimes it's about the quiet work of building and preserving beautiful things that last. I opened the family photo album I'd prepared, showing them pictures of my grandfather's restoration projects, my parents working together on historical buildings, the generations of craftspeople whose skills had shaped the very room we sat in. Your great-grandfather Blackwell made his fortune in banking, I told them gently. My great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. Both legacies matter. Both deserve respect. Eleanor rose abruptly, the movement lacking her usual grace. I need some air. She headed for the French doors leading to the garden, her rigid posture betraying the effort required to maintain dignity in retreat. Richard hesitated, clearly torn, between following his wife and continuing the conversation that had upended 3 years of family dynamics. I'm not sure what to say, he admitted, looking more human than I'd ever seen him. Except that perhaps we've all been operating under certain misconceptions. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, Dad, James replied with a hint of the dry humor that had first attracted me to him. Charlotte was examining the house with new eyes, her gaze traveling over architectural details she'd previously overlooked. All this time, we've been sitting in Sophia's family home, critiquing her taste and suggesting improvements to her heritage property. She shook her head in disbelief. The Thanksgiving dinners, the Christmas gatherings, all in a house that's been in your family for generations. It was never about the ownership, I assured her. I've always been happy to share this home with James's family. What hurt was the constant implication that I had nothing of value to contribute to the marriage beyond decorative qualities. Mother can be... Charlotte trailed off, searching for a diplomatic description. Ruthlessly focused on maintaining the family's social position, James suggested. A reluctant smile tugged at Charlotte's lips. Something like that. Richard stood, straightening his tie in a gesture that seemed to comfort him in moments of uncertainty. I should check on Eleanor. This has been quite a revelation. He paused at the French doors. Sophia, whatever the circumstances, I want you to know that your work on the Mills Project alternative was impressive. The preservation aspects you identified have actually enhanced the development's value considerably. It was perhaps the first genuine professional acknowledgement I'd received from my father-in-law in 3 years, all the more meaningful for coming after the revelation of my financial independence. With Richard and Eleanor momentarily absent, Charlotte leaned forward with newfound curiosity. So all this time, when Mother was making those awful comments about you marrying James for his money, I was actually the one with the family home, established business, and trust fund, I confirmed. Charlotte's laughter bubbled up unexpectedly. It's perfect. Absolutely perfect. She sobered, fixing her brother with a searching look. But why go along with it, James? You've always hated Mother's social climbing. Why participate in this charade? James reached for my hand across the table, our fingers intertwining in a gesture that had sustained us through 3 years of uncomfortable family gatherings. Because I needed to know if I could break free of the Blackwell expectations. Whether I could stand with Sophia even when it meant standing against Mother's influence. And did you? Charlotte asked softly. Stand with her, I mean? The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of the Mapleton Mills confrontation, the temporary separation, the difficult reconciliation. Not always, James admitted, his honesty both painful and healing. Not perfectly. But ultimately, yes. And that's how I knew our marriage could survive this revelation. Because we'd already weathered the worst test of our commitment to each other. Charlotte studied us with new respect. I've spent my entire adult life trying to meet Mother's expectations while maintaining some semblance of independence. I never considered simply rejecting the premise entirely. Through the French doors, we could see Eleanor and Richard engaged in intense conversation, Eleanor's gestures sharp with indignation, Richard's responses more measured but equally serious. "What do you think will happen now?" Charlotte asked, nodding toward their parents. "Mother will be furious for precisely 14 days, James predicted with the certainty of long experience. She'll avoid us, consult her social circle for advice on handling this betrayal, and then eventually decide that having a daughter-in-law with historic property holdings and a successful preservation business can be integrated into the Blackwell narrative with appropriate spin." I smiled despite myself, recognizing the accuracy of his assessment. The question is whether she'll ever see beyond the assets to the person. That, James acknowledged, remains to be seen. As if on cue, the French doors opened, and Eleanor re-entered the dining room with Richard following close behind. Her complexion was slightly flushed, but her composure had been largely restored. She took her seat with deliberate dignity, folding her napkin precisely across her lap before addressing me directly. "I owe you an apology, Sophia," she said, each word clearly costing her considerable effort. "It seems I have misunderstood certain aspects of your background." It was perhaps the most Eleanor Blackwell was capable of in the moment, an acknowledgement of factual error rather than a true apology for her behavior. But it represented a seismic shift in our relationship. Nonetheless, "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied simply. "I appreciate that." She nodded stiffly, then turned to James. "You might have corrected my misperceptions at any point during the past 3 years." "Would it have changed how you treated Sophia?" James asked pointedly. "Would knowing about her financial status have made you value her more as a person, as my wife?" Eleanor's flinch was barely perceptible, but it revealed the uncomfortable truth in his question. "That's hardly a fair assessment of my concerns. I simply wanted to ensure you weren't being taken advantage of. The irony," I noted gently, "is that if anyone benefited financially from our marriage, it was James. My investment advice has significantly outperformed the Blackwell Group's strategy for the past 2 years." Richard's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "Is that so? Perhaps we should discuss your approach sometime, Sophia. The preservation tax credits you identified for the Mills project have already attracted attention from other investors." Eleanor's mouth tightened at this pivot to business, perhaps recognizing it as the beginning of a shift in family dynamics she could no longer control. "Now that we've cleared up these misunderstandings," she said briskly, "perhaps we can return to our Thanksgiving dinner before everything is cold." It was a transparent attempt to reclaim control of the situation, to normalize what had just been irrevocably changed. For a moment, I considered allowing it. retreating into the familiar pattern of polite facades and unspoken tensions that had characterized our family gatherings for 3 years. Instead, I stood. Actually, before we continue, there's something else I'd like to share. I walked to the sideboard and retrieved a small, carefully wrapped package I'd placed there earlier. This is for you, Eleanor. She accepted the package with visible apprehension, as if it might contain further evidence of her misjudgments. When she carefully removed the wrapping, she revealed a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. "What is this?" she asked, opening it tentatively. "My grandmother's journal from 1943, I explained. The year she took over management of the restoration business while my grandfather served in the war. She wrote about the challenges of being a woman running a company in a male-dominated industry, about maintaining standards when materials were rationed, about preserving historically significant buildings when most people only cared about practical considerations." Eleanor turned the fragile pages slowly, her expression unreadable. "I thought you might find some of her experiences relevant," I continued. She also came from what most people considered humble beginnings. The daughter of a carpenter who taught herself business management and architectural drafting at a time when women weren't admitted to most technical programs. "Why would you give me this?" Eleanor asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Because despite our differences, we share something fundamental," I replied honestly. "We both built lives around preserving what we value. You, the Blackwell social position and financial legacy. Me, my family's commitment to architectural heritage. We've just had very different tools and perspectives." Eleanor's fingers traced the careful handwriting on the journal pages, perhaps seeing for the first time the complexity of the heritage she had so casually dismissed. "I'm not sure I deserve this glimpse into your family history," she said finally, an unexpected note of humility in her voice. "It's not about deserving," I told her. "It's about understanding. I don't expect this revelation to immediately transform our relationship, Eleanor. 3 years of assumptions and judgments don't disappear in a single afternoon. But perhaps we can begin again with honesty as our foundation." Richard cleared his throat, emotion briefly visible beneath his usual reserve. "I believe that's something we can all raise a glass to." He lifted his wine, the others following suit after a moment's hesitation. "To honesty and new beginnings." As we clinked glasses around the table, my antique crystal that Eleanor had previously assumed was a Blackwell heirloom, I caught James's eye across the arrangement of harvest flowers and candles. His expression held pride, love, and perhaps a touch of wonder at what we had accomplished together. Eleanor might never fully accept me on my own terms, rather than for what I owned or represented. The revelation of my financial standing might simply shift her dismissal to resentment at being deceived, but in this moment, something fundamental had changed in the delicate balance of power that had defined our family relationships for 3 years. The house that had witnessed generations of my family's history had now witnessed something equally significant: the dismantling of pretense, the painful but necessary step toward authenticity in a marriage built on love rather than social expectation. As we resumed our Thanksgiving dinner, the conversation flowed with a different energy, more cautious in some ways, more genuine in others. Charlotte asked about the restoration techniques used in maintaining the house's original features. Richard inquired about the business structure that had allowed Caldwell Restoration to survive economic downturns. Even Eleanor, still processing her dramatically altered understanding of her daughter-in-law, listened with new attention when I described my grandfather's craftsmanship. The gold digger narrative that had shadowed my marriage for 3 years had been permanently shattered. What would grow in its place remained to be seen, but whatever emerged would be built on the solid foundation of truth, rather than the shifting sands of assumption and prejudice. When dessert was served, my grandmother's maple pumpkin pie that Eleanor had previously attributed to James's thoughtfulness in finding recipes that make Sophia feel at home, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. Not just of my family heritage or financial standing, but of my identity as a woman who had built a life of substance and meaning long before the Blackwell name entered her story. The antique clock in the hallway chimed 5, its resonant tones, marking not just the hour but the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. My grandmother's clock, in my grandmother's house, witnessing a transformation that had been 3 Thanksgivings in the making. The weeks following Thanksgiving unfolded with surprising quietude, the explosive revelation that should have rocked. The Blackwell family seemed instead to have created a thoughtful pause, a collective catching of breath before determining what came next. Eleanor had departed that evening with uncharacteristic restraint, accepting her husband's gentle guidance toward their car, without the barrage of comments that would normally have followed such a dramatic shift in family dynamics. "She's regrouping," James observed as we cleared away the last remnants of Thanksgiving dinner. "Mother never retreats. She just withdraws to develop a more effective strategy." His assessment proved accurate. For 16 days, 2 days longer, than James had predicted, Eleanor maintained complete silence. No calls, no impromptu visits, no missives delivered through Richard or Charlotte. The absence of her customary meddling felt both liberating and strangely unsettling, like the sudden silence when a persistent noise finally stops. On the 17th day, a cream-colored envelope arrived by courier, Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, addressing it to both of us rather than just James, a small but significant acknowledgement of our partnership. Inside was an invitation to tea at the Blackwell estate the following afternoon, the formal language conveying an unmistakable message. This would be a carefully orchestrated meeting on Eleanor's territory and terms. "You don't have to go," James said as I studied the invitation. "We could suggest a neutral location instead." I shook my head, running my fingers over the embossed Blackwell monogram. "No, I think this is important. She's extending what she considers an olive branch. Meeting her halfway is the right response." The following day found us traversing the immaculate driveway leading to the Blackwell mansion, a property I'd visited dozens of times but always as an outsider looking in. Today felt different, not because I suddenly belonged in Eleanor's rarefied world, but because I no longer needed her approval to validate my place in her son's life. Eleanor received us in the conservatory, a room she rarely used for family gatherings, preferring the more formal drawing room for most occasions. The choice felt deliberate, a space filled with growing things rather than ancestral portraits, neutral territory within her domain. "James, Sophia," she greeted us with precise cordiality, gesturing toward the seating arrangement where tea had already been laid out on antique silver. "Thank you for coming." The next few minutes passed in the careful choreography of social ritual. Tea poured, small sandwiches offered, weather commented upon. Eleanor performed each element with practiced grace, her perfect posture and measured movements revealing nothing of her true purpose in arranging this meeting. Finally, after the preliminary requirements had been satisfied, she set down her cup with deliberate precision. "I've had time to reflect on our Thanksgiving discussion," she began, selecting each word with care. "It's clear that I've operated under certain misapprehensions regarding your circumstances, Sophia." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Eleanor Blackwell, it represented a significant concession. "I appreciate your acknowledgement," I replied simply. Eleanor nodded, a brief gesture of acceptance before continuing. "What I find most perplexing is why you maintained this pretense for 3 years. Surely you must have realized how it would appear when the truth eventually emerged." "We didn't begin with the intention to deceive," James explained, his tone gentle but firm. "It evolved gradually as we realized how deeply entrenched your assumptions were. By the time we might have corrected the misconception naturally, you had already established a narrative about Sophia that seemed impervious to evidence." Eleanor's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, A charitable interpretation. But an accurate one, I added. Your perception of me was fixed from our first meeting, Eleanor. Would knowing about my financial circumstances really have changed how you saw me as a person? The directness of the question seemed to catch her off guard. Eleanor had clearly prepared for recriminations or defensiveness, not for this calm inquiry into her own motivations. It would have... She hesitated, perhaps for the first time in our acquaintance, genuinely considering her answer rather than calculating its effect. It would have provided context I lacked. Context for what? James pressed. For seeing Sophia as worthy of respect? For accepting her as my choice of partner? Eleanor's gaze shifted to the conservatory's glass ceiling, watching the patterns of cloud movement rather than meeting her son's eyes. For understanding the dynamics of your relationship, she finally said. I was concerned that Sophia might be in a position of dependence that could lead to resentment over time. It was a remarkable reformulation of 3 years of thinly veiled accusations and dismissive comments, transforming her class prejudice into maternal concern. Yet, beneath the revision, I sensed a grain of genuine reflection, perhaps even a glimmer of uncomfortable self-awareness. I appreciate your concern, I said, surprising myself with the lack of bitterness in my voice. But what troubled me wasn't your misunderstanding of my financial position. It was your assumption that my worth as James's wife could be measured primarily in economic terms. Eleanor's gaze returned from the glass ceiling to meet mine directly. My generation approached marriage differently, she said after a moment. Compatibility was assessed through practical metrics: family background, financial prospects, social connections. These weren't shallow concerns, but pragmatic recognitions of what sustains a union beyond initial attraction. Those factors matter, James acknowledged, but they're not the foundation. Sophia and I share values and vision that transcend balance. Sheets or social standing, that's what you missed in your assessment. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips, not warm, exactly, but perhaps less rigid than her usual expression. Your father would say I missed the forest for the trees. He's quite impressed with Sophia's business acumen, by the way. The Mills Project alternative has attracted considerable attention in development circles. It was a pivot to safer territory, acknowledging my professional competence rather than addressing the more personal dimensions of our conflict. I decided to allow it, recognizing that Eleanor's capacity for emotional vulnerability had likely reached its limit for one afternoon. The project is proceeding well, I confirmed. We've secured additional tax incentives for the historical preservation elements, which improves the overall return profile significantly. Eleanor nodded with what appeared to be genuine interest. Richard mentioned you've developed a unique approach to balancing preservation requirements with commercial viability. He wondered if you might share your insights at the next Blackwell Foundation board meeting. The invitation, communicated through Eleanor rather than directly from Richard, represented a significant shift. Not acceptance into the Blackwell. Inner circle, perhaps, but recognition of professional value independent of my marriage to James. I'd be happy to prepare a presentation, I replied, accepting the olive branch for what it was, not friendship or even warmth, but the beginning of a different kind of relationship based on mutual recognition, if not affection. The remainder of our tea proceeded with less tension, conversation flowing through safer channels of business developments and community projects. As we prepared to leave, Eleanor surprised me by retrieving a small package from a side table. I found this in the attic last week, she said, handing me the carefully wrapped object. It seemed relevant to our new understanding. Inside the package was a leather-bound book documenting the architectural history of prominent homes in our region, including, to my astonishment, the original design specifications and historical photographs of my family's Victorian. Richard's grandfather commissioned it in 1935, Eleanor explained. He was apparently an amateur architectural historian before the war changed everyone's priorities. Your house is featured prominently in the chapter on Victorian influences. I turned the pages carefully, finding detailed drawings of the original, floor plan, notes on materials and craftsmanship, and a photograph showing my great-grandfather standing proudly on the very porch where the Blackwells had gathered for Thanksgiving 3 weeks earlier. "This is remarkable," I said, genuinely moved by the unexpected gift. I had no idea such a comprehensive documentation existed. "The Blackwell and Caldwell families have apparently been neighbors longer than either of us realized," Eleanor observed, with careful neutrality, though in rather different spheres. It wasn't quite an acknowledgement of equal standing, but it represented a significant evolution from her previous dismissal of my family's contributions to the community we shared. "Different spheres that occasionally intersected," I agreed, showing her a photograph capturing a civic function from 1949 where both our grandfathers appeared, standing on opposite sides of the same charity project presentation. "History has a way of revealing unexpected connections," Eleanor conceded, her tone suggesting this philosophical observation was as close to warmth as she could currently manage. As we drove home through the winter twilight, James reached across the console to take my hand. "That went better than I expected," he said, a note of cautious optimism in his voice. "Your mother will never truly accept me as an equal," I replied honestly. "But I think she's beginning to see me as a person with legitimate value beyond my relationship to you. It's a start." James nodded thoughtfully. "Mother measures people's worth through their accomplishments and influence. Now that she understands yours extend beyond what she initially assumed, she'll adjust accordingly. It's not friendship or even genuine respect yet, but it's a foundation to build upon." 3 days later, a formal letter arrived from Richard Blackwell's office, inviting me to join the advisory committee for the Blackwell Foundation's Historic Preservation Initiative, a newly created position that would involve evaluating grant applications for restoration projects throughout the region. The invitation represented not just professional recognition, but a strategic repositioning within the Blackwell universe. No longer the gold-digging outsider, but a useful connection with relevant expertise. "Pragmatic acceptance," James observed as I considered the invitation. The Blackwell approach to integrating new realities into the existing power structure. I laughed despite myself. "At least it's honest in its way. Your mother has decided that if she can't dismissively categorize me as beneath notice, she might as well leverage my expertise for family purposes. Will you accept?" James asked, genuinely curious rather than directive. I considered the question carefully, weighing the complex implications. Joining the committee would integrate me further into Blackwell family operations, potentially creating new tensions as boundaries shifted. Yet it would also provide a platform for advancing preservation projects I genuinely valued, using the Blackwell resources to support work I believed in. "I think I will," I decided finally. Not to gain Eleanor's approval or to secure my position in the family hierarchy, but because it's an opportunity to do meaningful work. That's always been my priority, regardless of whose name is on the funding. The first committee meeting in January proved surprisingly productive. Eleanor attended in her capacity as foundation chair, but allowed Richard to lead the discussion. Her contributions focused on procedural questions rather than assertions of authority. My presentation on preservation-focused development models was received with genuine interest, several board members approaching afterward to discuss potential applications to their own properties. Charlotte cornered me during the reception that followed, wine glass in hand and a conspiratorial gleam in her eye. "You've accomplished the impossible," she murmured. "Mother actually referred to you as quite knowledgeable during yesterday's tennis club luncheon. Coming from her, that's practically a coronation." I smiled, accepting the information for the peace offering it represented. "Small steps, giant leaps for Blackwell kind," Charlotte countered with unexpected humor. "David and I would love to have you and James for dinner next week, without parental supervision. I'd like to get to know my sister-in-law properly. without Mother's narrative coloring everything. The invitation felt genuine. Perhaps the first overture from James's family motivated by personal connection rather than obligation or calculation. "We'd enjoy that," I replied simply. As winter mellowed into spring, the rhythms of our relationship with the Blackwell family gradually established a new pattern, not the warm integration I might once have hoped for, but a measured respect that felt more genuine than the strained politeness of our earlier interactions. Eleanor would never fully relinquish her assessment of me as fundamentally different from the Blackwell circle, but she had developed a grudging appreciation for the qualities she had previously dismissed. On a bright April morning, as I supervised the installation of restored woodwork at the Westmore Library, I received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Blackwell, impeccably dressed as always but somehow less imposing than she had once seemed, navigated the construction site with careful steps. "Impressive progress," she observed, surveying the transformed reading room with its newly restored plasterwork and gleaming wood paneling. "Richard was right about your attention to detail." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely surprised by her presence in my professional domain. The original craftsmanship deserved proper restoration. Eleanor nodded, her gaze traveling over the intricate ceiling medallions my team had spent weeks recasting and installing. "I wanted to let you know personally that the Foundation Board unanimously approved the expanded preservation grant program you proposed. The first funding cycle will open next month." The news represented a significant victory, not just for me personally, but for the preservation community I had championed for years. "That's wonderful news. The matching fund structure should encourage private investment in historically significant properties throughout the region." "Yes, well," Eleanor adjusted her designer scarf with characteristic precision. "Richard is quite convinced of the economic benefits, and the tax advantages are substantial. Practical considerations aside, however, there is something to be said for maintaining connections to our architectural heritage. It was as close to an endorsement of my life's work as Eleanor Blackwell was likely to offer, acknowledging the value of preservation while carefully framing it within pragmatic financial considerations rather than sentimental attachment to history. "I've always believed that understanding where we come from helps shape where we're going," I said, offering a bridge between our different perspectives. "Whether that's family history or community heritage." Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a momentary glimpse of something that might have been genuine reflection before her social mask reasserted itself. "Yes, well, the committee will need your expertise in evaluating the technical aspects of the grant applications. We'll be counting on your judgment." As she departed with a precisely calibrated nod of acknowledgement, I realized that we had established something neither of us could have anticipated during that first uncomfortable meeting 3 years earlier. Not friendship or even mutual admiration, but a working relationship built on recognition of each other's competence and value within our respective spheres. That evening, as James and I enjoyed dinner on the porch of our home, my ancestral home that had weathered a century of history before becoming the setting for our own unfolding story, I found myself reflecting on the journey from pretense to authenticity that had transformed not just our marriage, but our place within the complex ecosystem of family relationships. "Do you regret it?" James asked, perhaps following the direction of my thoughts. "The experiment? The years of playing along with Mother's assumptions? The confrontation at Thanksgiving?" I considered the question carefully, watching the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold that highlighted the heritage roses my grandmother had planted decades before I was born. "No," I finally answered. "Not the revelation itself, that was necessary and ultimately healing. But I do wish we hadn't felt it necessary to hide parts of ourselves for so long. Authenticity should have been our foundation from the beginning." James nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About the Blackwell tendency to manage perceptions rather than simply living truthfully. It's a family pattern I don't want to continue." What would that look like for us going forward? I asked, curious about his vision. His smile held both certainty and openness to possibility. Building something real together, not just professionally or financially, but personally. Creating a home and legacy based on what we truly value, rather than what impresses others or meets external expectations. As the evening deepened around us, the antique porch swing creaking gently beneath us, just as it had for generations of my family, I felt a profound sense of rightness. Not because we had achieved some perfect resolution with the Blackwells, or because all tensions had magically dissolved, but because we had finally established our marriage on the solid ground of truth, rather than the shifting sands of accommodation and pretense. Eleanor might never fully shed her prejudices or truly see beyond the social categories that defined her worldview. Richard would likely continue to evaluate relationships primarily through the lens of practical advantage, but James and I had broken free of the expectations and assumptions that had constrained us, creating space to build something authentic together. The Victorian house that had witnessed 4 generations of my family's history now stood ready to embrace whatever future we would create. A home defined not by who owned it, but by the values, work, and love that filled its rooms. The gold digger narrative that had shadowed our early years had been permanently dispelled, replaced by the more complex but infinitely more satisfying reality of a partnership between equals who had chosen each other for the right reasons, as twilight settled over the garden my grandparents had planted. I rested my head against James's shoulder, content in the knowledge that our story would continue to unfold according to our own vision rather than anyone else's expectations. Blackwell, Caldwell, or otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.